Welcome. I'm delighted to have you all here this evening, and I'm very honored to help kick off this panel about ROLM. I was instrumental in helping make this happen. I invited the R, and then Pierre-Luigi invited the O, who invited the L and M. I think that's how it went. So, now one of my jobs here before we start is to remind you to please all turn off your cell phones and trios, please, if you would just take a minute to do that. So I'm going to take up a few minutes here, less than 5 I promise, to just tell you a little bit about the museum. This is important to us because there's so many of you who haven't been here before, and those of you who are regulars, please forgive me for what will be redundant information for you. But the rest of you may not know much about us. Our goal here is to create really the defining world-class museum about the history of computing. A little bit about the start of the museum. It started with the Boston Computer Museum, which you may be familiar with. You may not realize that that museum isn't there any longer, and Gordon and Gwen Bell, who are both here this evening, as well as my husband, Len Shustik, sort of hijacked the collection from the Boston Museum, brought it out here to be the foundation collection of this museum, and has since doubled or tripled the collection, so has grown it substantially since then. Our mission is to collect and display the artifacts of the information age, and there is no other museum like us in the world today. There's many small museums, there's little company museums, but believe it or not, there isn't a museum of this scale anywhere else. There's, as you know, probably an aviation museum in every state in the Union. I've seen quilt museums, sports museums, film museums, so it seems to me that it's appropriate for us to have a museum as well. We collect, you'll see a lot of hardware and displays downstairs, but we also collect software, videos, photos, documentation, even t-shirts and mugs. And there's some wonderful ROLM material on display downstairs, so make sure you see that before you go. And this really is our number one passion here is collection. Make sure we collect all these things before they disappear. And to me, the speaker series is a little bit about collection, too. It's collection of the stories. I didn't mean it that way. I didn't mean it that way. It's the collection of the stories that they give us. Getting beyond collection, we'd like to display this stuff. Today we have some things on display downstairs. We call it visible storage. We call it that for a reason because it's not how we hope to display it over time. When we really become a full-fledged museum, you'll see nice multimedia exhibits and the sort of things that you're used to in a museum. We have lots of programs, the speaker series. We have a fellows program where we honor technologists, entrepreneurs, inventors who've created huge inventions in our industry. We have retrospectives. We've had them on DEC, on Apple, on the Ethernet. We support research, patent research, academic research. We do machine restoration. In fact, we just had PDP-1, was what it was, that we just got up and running just a day or two ago. So that was pretty exciting. We have, it's in a nice, we've got raised floor rooms where we're going to display this stuff and all. We have legions of volunteers, many of whom are here tonight, who help us with all these things, and a staff of about 15. So why do we do all this? Is this just sort of geek nostalgia, or what is the point? Well, I think there's a couple of points to it. First is that this really is one of the most important inventions of all time, and many of us here have had a role in creating that. And, we really need to preserve the raw materials today for future researchers who will ask questions that we can't even contemplate today. Secondly, I really view it as a place of inspiration for youth. We have many sports heroes and movie heroes, and I want to make heroes out of these guys and everybody else who's created a piece of this industry, and that's part of what we're trying to do here. That was how I was trying to recover from that artifact thing I said earlier. And finally, I think this is important because it's about building community, and it really is an important place to bring the community together here in Silicon Valley. So we need your help. Please help us in every way you can. That might be artifacts or stories yourself that you have. A volunteer. We always have openings for lots of volunteers. Spread the word. Tell people. A lot of people don't know about us yet. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you as well for your financial support, both to consider our capital campaign to help build the displays that we want to build, as well as for the annual campaign and becoming a member, which keeps the lights on, if you will. So that's my brief commercial, and I'd like to turn now to the evening's program. And I get to introduce to you the moderator for tonight, Leo Chamberlain. And Leo... Leo appears to be well known in this group, and he came all the way from Hawaii. Now, I'd like you to guess which guy is Leo. So he was an executive in a variety of roles that he's going to tell you about at ROLM from 1974 through his retirement in 1982. He served as a director of KLA Tencor, Octel, and Tektronix in addition to ROLM. Prior to ROLM, he served in the military and is a graduate of Cornell University. Now, I tried to circulate a little bit with those of you who know Leo and ask a few questions to get a few tidbits on Leo, so this is what I got. He's obsessed with whales, I guess. He has a lot of Leoisms, so you know that thing about the alligators and being up to your in alligators? Well, he had a sign on his desk, "Don't feed the alligators," which I like a lot. But the favorite story I heard before we got up here is apparently after Gene Richeson left, Leo went to Ken Oshman to propose that the company be renamed CHOLM. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you Leo Chamberlain.
They wouldn't do it. Will any of you who have ever worked at ROLM please stand?
That's the room.
We on the podium would like to thank you for making it a great place to work. My name is Leo Chamberlain. I was the 105th employee at Ford's Drive in Cupertino on February 4th, 1974, at which time I was hired as Vice President Marketing. In 1976, I was appointed Vice President and General Manager of the Mil-Spec Computer Division, wherein we protected you and your loved ones from the communist horde. In 1980, I was made Executive Vice President and appointed to the Board of Directors. I retired to Hawaii. My wife was born and brought up in Buffalo, New York, and she was freezing before my very eyes. But I remained on the board until IBM purchased the company in 1984. ROLM was founded in 1969 or 1968, depending on which founder you ask. It's an acronym for the last names of the four founders from whom we shall hear shortly. ROLM's original product was a rugged mini computer that was designed to meet military specifications for temperature, shock, and vibration. It ran data general software thanks to a license agreement between the two companies. It was the first off-the-shelf militarized computer. Its competitors were giant military contractors who often designed much higher cost custom computers for each military application. By 1974, revenues were $6 million. The company had been profitable since 1971. In addition to an expanding line of mil-spec computers, ROLM began development of the first all-digital, computer-controlled, private automatic branch exchange called the CBX. Just keep in mind that mil-spec kept you in business for the first few years.
Kept you in business for 13 years.
The PABX is the switching device within an organization that connects internal extensions to one another and to outside telephone trunk lines. The computer made possible such unique, at the time, telephone features: privacy, call pickup, follow me, call waiting. It made such unique system features as call detail recording, route optimization, automatic call distribution, remote moves and system changes, and centralized attendance service, for which I will never forgive us. And eventually, phone mail. Sorry, Bob. Bob Cohn's here. He called it voicemail. Introduced in 1975, by 1977, 18 of the 50 largest U.S. companies owned a CBX. Most of them paid for it. 8 of those had multiple installations. Revenue that year was $30 million, and there were 600 employees. How such a small company could successfully compete with a giant AT&T with its phenomenal resources will be discussed later. By 1983, 12,000 CBX systems had been installed, representing more than 2.2 million voice lines and over 10,000 data connections. Revenues that year were $502 million, and there were 7,000 employees. In 1984, the year IBM bought the company, revenues were $786 million. There were 8,940 employees, of whom some are here, and ROLM was number 224 on the Fortune 500 list. In addition to the concept of an off-the-shelf militarized computer and the early adoption of an all-digital, computer-controlled telecommunications, ROLM pioneered the great place to work, employee philosophy, and extended service leave, and was one of the very few companies in Silicon Valley who hired and promoted women in management positions. I think you can see the result. My sons worked for 10 years before they had a male manager. The questions begin. Am I coming across? Yeah. No, I meant, mentally. I'd like to ask each of the founders to tell who they are and how they got to Silicon Valley, and start with the R. Gene Richeson.
People say that context is everything, and certainly in respect to my history with ROLM, that certainly applies. I was born in a small town in Texas, as I guess all of us came from there originally, that had fewer than 1,000 people, and now I've wound up in a town that same size, though not in Texas. Born just before Pearl Harbor, I was finishing high school at the time the Russians launched Sputnik. And in those days, if you could do math, you got a pretty easy path to go to college and study engineering, which I did. And when we studied engineering, at the time, a couple of us were in the same class. We all went to the same school, a little Rice, it was called the Rice Institute at that time in Houston. And we were the last class, at least Ken and I were, in electrical engineering that had to study power, which is the transmission and generation of electrical power, and also the last class to do vacuum tubes. And so we died. There we are. Following undergraduate school, I came to California for a summer job. And I think at that point in my life, it was the first time I saw an ocean. So I was sort of sheltered in that regard. And I planned only to stay for a summer, and that was 45 years ago or so, a long time ago. So that's really where I came from.
Thank you, Gene. Ken?
And I'm Ken Oshman.
Excuse me, Ken, you didn't read the thing I gave you.
This message has been approved by me. What I wanted to, I'm really surprised. It's something I just learned. All these years, I grew up in a little town in Texas, and I always thought the Gulf of Mexico was an ocean. At any rate, I followed more or less.
That's the Texas perspective.
I still think it's an ocean. So I got here the same way Gene did, except I have to add that the reason I actually got to California was that a guy named Burt McMurtry, who I'm sure many of you know, Burt McMurtry was a Rice graduate who was working at Sylvania at the time, and I had decided to go to Boston to business school at Harvard. I was married. Barbara was looking for a job teaching in Boston. We weren't having a lot of success with that, and we needed that. And Burt McMurtry came into a lab that I was student assistant there running the lab, because that was the only way he could get me to talk to him. And he was at a company out here called Sylvania Electric Products. And Bert was trying to convince me that it was more important to go to graduate school in electrical engineering and come to California and work for Sylvania than it was to go to business school, which that didn't sound that important to me. But as the more I thought about it, and the harder it was for Barbara to find a job, and the more well, actually, he went away and he wrote me a 10-page handwritten letter, which was his style in those days, if any of you know him, telling me all the reasons I should come to Stanford and go to graduate school and work for Sylvania. And I did, and that's how really I got here, is he convinced me to do that. Now, the interesting thing is that in those days, there were 21 people in our graduating electrical engineering class at Rice University. Bert recruited 7 of us. It's amazing. But Bert did recruit 7 of us, and we all got out here to Silicon Valley, which was really not called Silicon Valley at that time. Sylvania was a wonderful breeding ground of entrepreneurial spirit, because in those days, pretty much everybody went around and tried to find a government contract to support themselves. That was the way Sylvania operated. And Sylvania was actually I think the genesis, that whole culture at Sylvania was the genesis of a number of companies. In fact, it was the genesis of a company that ultimately spawned the guy who financed ROLM, who's sitting right here, Jack Melker. Jack was at Sylvania too, and he went off to start a company, and a lot of companies started out of Sylvania, and that's how I got to Silicon Valley, was by coming to Sylvania. The wonderful thing was they paid me to work there. They let all of us that worked there, Walter and Gene and I, they gave us a couple of hours off 3 days a week to go to school. And most importantly, they found a teaching job for Barbara.
Before you start, Walter, do you mean you got a PhD for a couple hours a week?
Well, Stanford was easier in those days.
Oh. Thanks, Gabby. Okay, Walter.
Okay, my history is pretty much the same as these guys. I was born and raised in Houston, Texas. Went to Rice University. I'm a little older than they are, and so I think I was one of the first guys to get recruited by Bert McMurtry. So Bert's a pretty convincing guy. I went in the service for a couple of years and then decided that I'd rather live on the West Coast rather than Houston, Texas. And the opportunity to go to Stanford for graduate work seemed like a good thing, particularly since Sylvania was paying for me to go to graduate school. And so I ended up at Sylvania also, and spent most of my life here in the Bay Area.
Thank you, Walter. Bob?
Well, I grew up in Texas, in a little bit bigger town than, well, not as big as Walter did, but bigger than Ken and Gene. I grew up in Wichita Falls, which was maybe 100,000 people. And found my way to Rice. I was always interested sort of in engineering kinds of things, and it was had a great reputation for engineering and science, and it was free. There was zero tuition at Rice in those days. Tuition started a couple of years after I graduated, so we all had free tuition. When I was finishing up in the electrical engineering program, I was starting to interview companies, and I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I thought I'd like to do graduate work, but I'd also like to work, and I was fascinated with computers, and so there were two choices really. MIT and Stanford were the two really great graduate schools, and I believe that, and Bert McMurtry interviewed me on the campus, and for Sylvania. And then after that, he sicked Ken Oshman on me, who had gone to work the year before. Ken and Gene were in a class a year ahead of me. And so he sicked Ken on me, and so Ken called and invited me to come out for an interview trip to California, which I did. And he and his wife, Barbara, really showed me, wined and dined me, and took me up, I remember, to the Shadows restaurant in San Francisco, and just blew me away with the wonders of California, and, you know, wine that didn't come in screw-top bottles. And so I knew when that trip was over that I was headed for California. But I was really interested in computers, and actually what I had done was managed to get an interview also at IBM while I was out here interviewing Sylvania. And IBM in San Jose, they blew in my ear and said, if you come work for us, you can play with computers. And that intrigued me, so I wound up, Ken did a great recruiting job, but I wound up going to work for IBM down in San Jose. As far as I know, that's the only thing Ken's ever failed at in his life. But so that's how I came out here, and IBM had the same program Sylvania did, where you could go to Stanford and also work part-time. So I did, and eventually got a master's and a PhD at Stanford.
Thank you, Bob.
I want to add a couple of things, Leo.
Go right ahead.
Because
By all
people,
means.
they wouldn't say this about themselves, but when I was at Rice, one of the jobs I had was I graded papers for the math department. And it was one of those jobs where it was about 25 cents an hour the first year and $10 an hour the second year and about $100 if you could last to the third year. And one of the ways of doing that that was easier was to find whoever was the best student in the class and use his paper to then, it was a lot faster than solving the problems yourself. And that was how I came to learn who Bob Maxfield was, because he was a year behind me, but I graded his papers for 2 years, and after about the first 6 weeks, it was always the paper I went for first, because he was, and it turned out Bob was the #1 student in his class. And that he wouldn't say about himself, but also about that time, I remember hearing one of our professors in talking about that, made the comment about that Bob was the #1 in his class, but he said Ken was probably the best student he had seen in a generation. And that was something of the quality those two came from. So that's why Walter and I were eager to associate with him.
That's nice of you to say, Gene, but it does show senility.
Walter, how did you get together and why start a company?
Oh, how did we start all this?
You've had this question for 3 weeks, Walter.
Yeah. Do I have 3 weeks to answer?
No.
About 3 minutes. Well, we, 3 of the 4 of us were working at Sylvania, and I was in a department at Sylvania which was looking at new opportunities for Sylvania to get into the non-military business. Most of my experience had been in building military equipment. When I was doing that, it suddenly occurred to me that instead of helping Sylvania get into business, it might be more interested if I went into business. Unfortunately, the senior management at Sylvania didn't like this a lot. So we parted ways, and I spent...
Didn't they fire you?
Well, that's one way of putting it. I believe they gave me the choice, and I quit. But it was a near thing, let's put it that way. At any rate, I spent several months looking at different business opportunities without a lot of success, and then decided, well, I better do something to make a living. So I started doing some consulting, and about that time, I got the best phone call I ever got in my life, and it was from Ken Oshman, who said, I hear you're thinking about starting a company. Why don't we do something together? And I said, well, you know, that's a good idea. And that's how it all got started. And there's more to it, of course.
Sure. Thank you very much. That's
the big-
great. Bob, how did you decide on the first product? You're going to answer that.
Well, do you want to?
Why don't you let
Well, I'll do a
Ken
little
tell-
more of the sort of how the
Yeah,
I
how
got
we all
started.
four got together.
I have a thing marked down here I cannot change.
No, it can't be changed.
Says M.
You know,
M.
well, as I recall,
Yeah, you tell us.
giving a little from senility, Ken said, well, you know, you and I are pretty good at engineering and what have you. And Ken said, I think we ought to have, I know this guy, Gene Richeson, who I think is a good guy. And I knew Gene rather well myself. And I said, I think Gene's a great guy. Why don't we see if he's interested? So Gene joined us. We were doing some business plans. And Gene had this great idea of making a computer that would meet military specifications and be off the shelf. Because at that time, computers were just getting into the military, and Gene can tell you more about that. But we said, that's a great idea. We put it in our business plan, and Ken said, well, wait a minute. Neither one of the three of us know anything about computers. But I know a great guy who works for IBM who knows about computers. Why don't we get him to join us? And so Bob Maxfield then joined us. So that's my recollection of how it happened.
You know, that isn't the way it happened.
Oh, okay.
It's close.
But damn, that's a better story.
That's what's important.
Bob, do you think that was, I mean,
Well, it was close, but
could you add anything to it?
well, the best phone call I got was from Ken Oshman, and this was about September, October of '68. I was just finishing up my PhD at Stanford and starting to do job interviews and try to figure out where I was going to go to work. And one thing I knew, having done my PhD, which I didn't know when I started my PhD, was I really didn't want to do research. Research was okay, but I really was more interested in sort of products and real stuff. So I was a little frustrated because the only people that wanted to interview me for jobs were research outfits like Bell Labs and IBM Research, and because I was getting a PhD. So I get a call from Ken Oshman one day, and he says, you know, what are you going to do when you get out of Stanford? Or, you know, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm just thinking about what kind of job to get. And he said, well, Gene Richeson and Walter Loewenstern and I are thinking about starting a company, and we were wondering if you'd like to join us. And I said, sure. Actually, the first thing that happened was I got this sheer terror in my throat about, well, you know, I could go get a job for a pretty good salary, and I had a 4-month-old baby and living in a little 2-bedroom apartment. But I said, sure, what the hell. So I started meeting with these guys, and this was before the idea of the computer. That's the key thing. I was involved for 2 or 3 months, and we had a business plan with lots of products that Walter and you guys had thought up. And we weren't able to, we were out looking for money for venture capital. And there wasn't anybody that liked any of those products or liked the stuff we were thinking about doing, not to mention that we were all 20-somethings and all engineers, and, you know, no marketing guy, no manufacturing, you know, nobody with a finance background, no manufacturing background. And so then the idea of the computer came later, and Gene was really the one that came up with that idea. So, and I remember that came on a Saturday. We were sitting around drinking beer, working on the latest version of the business plan. So, Gene, why don't you take it from there?
Well, I'd always been, around computers, but I was never a good enough student to actually get access to one. They were always behind locked doors and in places that weren't available, and so I was always trying to figure out how I could get one, and that went on for a long time. I remember when we went to undergraduate school at Rice, there was one computer there, I think the Rice computer, whose creator is actually here tonight. I saw him earlier, Professor Martin Graham. But it was behind a locked door, and maybe one day you might get a chance to visit it or something. But Ken actually got to work for him on that computer. But still, they were always these elusive things and always too expensive. And so when the mini computers first became available, that was getting closer. Then you could get a computer for about what you paid for a house in Sunnyvale, as I recall. And but at least it was, you know, approachable. And the first computer I ever bought as an engineer was a PDP-8S, and this was in 1967. And I began to, and that one was only about the first $10,000 computer. The S stood for either slow or serial, depending on your point of view. But it was a computer, but it wouldn't do much. But that was the history, and then Data General had come along and announced this Nova computer, which I think it was the summer of 1968. They got a lot of publicity, and if you were interested in computers, you couldn't have missed it. And I think we went to the Fall Joint, Bob and I were just talking, went to the Fall Joint Computer Conference in Las Vegas in the fall of 1968 and saw it. And they had it running a computer game of all things, Space Wars, which I think was developed at SRI. And that sort of proved, they hadn't delivered one, but they actually had an operating one there. And it looked like you really could get a computer for $10,000 or thereabouts. And not only that, but this was also when the first medium-scale integrated circuits were getting really available. And so the IC is what made this proliferation of computers. Suddenly there were like, I think we counted up almost 60 mini computer companies in 1968 were on the market. So we were too late to build a mini computer. We needed to build something that found us a niche, and that's where the idea of the rugged computer came from.
Gene had been working at Sylvania and had actually been trying to buy a computer for a military program, as I remember, and said, you know, there's a market there. Nobody makes these things that are off the shelf and you can just get and buy at a reasonable price and that have some minimal software with them. And the way that computers were bought in those days for military applications was you went to CDC and you said, this is what I'd like to do, develop me a computer over the next few years with this I/O and this much memory and this instruction set, and they were all custom computers, very expensive, one of a kind. Every airplane had a different computer, every ship had a different computer, more or less. And so it was really Gene's idea that there was a business and an opportunity to make a standard off-the-shelf computer that could go into military applications. And I think it was the reason ROLM got off the ground. I should tell you, we had a bunch of business ideas. As Bob said, we had a bunch of business ideas. They ranged from vehicle location systems to security systems. And I took this business plan, well, we all took it, but I remember taking it to Jack Melker. And he looked at this and he said, you know, no company can succeed with all this junk. you guys go back to the drawing board and come back with an idea. Well, at that time, we didn't have an idea. But Gene and Bob went off to the computer show, and they came up with this idea, and lo and behold, it stuck. And it worked out as a reasonable business plan, though nobody in the world would fund it except Jack Melker, who was good enough to fund it on the same basis as the rest of us. We each put in $15,000, including Jack, and that's the way we started ROLM.
Amazing. Thank you, Ken. Talking about backgrounds, I remember in an early interview with Ken, he said, I see you were an electrical engineering graduate. I said, yes, sir. And he said, what was your specialty? And I said, vacuum tubes. And he said, do you know anything about marketing? Walter, how did you decide on a company name?
Okay, again, well, I'll have to tell you my recollection. You know, I am quite a bit older than the rest of these guys. So I think Alzheimer's may be setting in a little early. At any rate, my recollection is we did a business plan when Jack Melchior said, wait a minute, guys, you can't do all these things. If you'll just do the military computer, I'll fund it. We said, okay. And we wrote the business plan, and Ken actually wrote the business plan, and in it, he took the last letters of each of our names. Well, first of all, we tried to get a name for the company through the California Corporate Commissioner, but all the names we proposed, we couldn't get. Do you remember that?
Yeah,
Daytel and whatever. Everybody had all these data something names. And so Ken didn't know what to do in the business plan, and so he took the 4 letters of our last name, and just for something to do, he used them in different orders throughout the business plan. And ROLM seemed to make the most sense. And so we got stuck with that because we couldn't think of anything else to call the company.
The second best name was Moeller, and until one of our wives said, that sounds like a dentist's outfit, so it was wrong.
It was only supposed to last 2 or 3 weeks till we came up with a name.
Yeah.
That's what I remember anyway. It was
Yeah,
just
everybody said obviously this name could never
It's a
stick
temporary
because
thing.
it's too weird.
It was a temporary thing, but we had a few people in the early days of ROLM that were really great advisors and helpers. And one was a guy named John Wilson, who died about 6 or 7 years ago, I think. John was the founder of Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati. And John was our first lawyer, and actually, along with Jack, was on our board. That was our initial board of directors. And John looked at it and he said, you know, that's a good name. Let's use that. And so we just let it stick.
Thank you very much. Bob, you're next. Could you give the audience an idea of some of the unique technical challenges facing military computers?
Okay. Well, you know, I might just add one thing. The day we came up with the idea for the military computers was a Saturday afternoon. We were sitting around, you know, trying to figure something out. Gene came up with the idea of the computer, and it evolved from there to they turned to me, and they, you know, he sort of gave the marketing pitch for why there was a good niche for it, and they turned to me and said, well, Maxfield, could you build such a thing? Could you build a rugged computer? And I said, beats the hell out of me, but, you know, we could probably figure it out. And what would it sell for? And I said, well, you know, gosh, I guess if it could be done at all, it could be done for manufacturing costs no more than 2 or 3 times what a commercial machine would be, and that was still about a factor of 10 less than what a military computer cost in those days. So that seemed, or that we could sell it for that factor of 10. So then it was, well, obviously, which of these 60, then the idea was, let's don't do anything from scratch. We don't have any, you know, any money. The way to do it is to do a militarized version of a commercial computer so that people can program the commercial computer, get all their stuff done, and when they're ready to deploy the rugged version, then they buy our machine. So then the question, okay, which one do we do? Do we go to DEC? Do we go to HP? Do we go to any of 50 other startup companies? And within, you know, and then we basically decided, well, the best would be Data General for several reasons. First of all, they're a startup just like us. They're only a year old, so they're not likely to take our idea and run away with it like a big company might. And we could license their architecture and get all their software, and then all we'd have to worry about is how to build a ruggedized version of this thing, or very mil-spec. So so we said, okay, well, let's call Data General. This is all one Saturday afternoon. Ken walks over, picks up the telephone, gets information in Boston, and asks for Ed DeCastro, who was the president of Data General, and happened to get him on the phone and said, well, you've never heard of me, but me and 3 other guys are interested in starting a company, and we'd like to license your architecture. And DeCastro said, yeah, why not? And Ken said, he said, well, we'll talk. So Ken and Gene got on a red eye the next Friday night, less than a week later, went to Boston, And there were 12 employees of Data General in a storefront trying to get their first shipped computer out the door at the time, and negotiated a deal with Ed DeCastro, and then we did our business plan. So anyway, that's an interjection. So. The mil-spec computer. So we had everything we needed in terms of the basic design. The issue was the mil-specs meant it had to operate from minus 55 degrees C to plus 95 degrees C. It had to withstand 15 Gs of shock. It had to withstand 10 Gs of vibration over a very wide vibration range. It had to withstand 95% humidity, and it had to withstand, and you had to be able to put it out in a salt sea environment or a sand and dust environment, and it had to work. And
Does that sound like someone that's lived with those specs?
they're burned into my brain. MIL E5400, MIL E16400, that's the names of the specs. Anyway, and the other thing is it had to be packaged in something about the size of a shoebox, as opposed to something that fit in a rack like all the early computers did. So, the processor design was a little straightforward, although the problem was we had to get integrated circuits that would work over the temperature range. There were such things, but they weren't always available, the same ones that Data General had used in their design, so we had to do some redesigns there. The other key problems were the memory, the core memory, power supply, and then the rugged packaging. So Walter took on the responsibility of designing the power supply, and we hired, Gene had a great digital designer friend of his at ESL that we were able to hire, who took over the processor design, Merle Wetherell. And so I decided, well, okay, I'll do the memory, but I don't know anything about memory, so I went out and found a subcontractor down in Southern California that had been an engineering manager at Electronic Memories, which was one of the people that built the core memory arrays in the early days. And they made a mil-spec version of a core memory array. So we hired this guy to design our memory. And then we all worked together on the packaging, the rugged packaging, and came up with lots of creative ideas for how to cool it and make it rugged. And, you know, it was basically a mechanical engineering job. I became a mechanical engineer pretty quickly. So that was the challenge. We started operations June 1st. The idea was to have a working prototype at the Fall Joint Computer Conference in November of 1969, which we did. And then we were to ship the first product the following March, which we did. And had a great team of people, very small. We had, the first tech we hired was a guy named Ron Deal. First assembler we hired is here tonight, Vanita Alvarez. Kirby Randall, Merle Wetherell, and just, about 4 people. And it was a great experience.
Somebody in the audience mentioned that she was hired even though she was underage. Is that true, Bobby? Gene, do you recall the software license being as easily negotiated as they do?
Well, we got a tacit agreement. They said, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, that's the easy part.
And the details will come later. And they got more complicated as we went. But it all worked out.
It all worked out. Great.
Over time.
Ken, why did you decide to diversify? I mean, wasn't military computers good enough?
Well, actually, there's a story. You know, we had set out as a business. We had always said, we're not going to run this company like a military contractor, selling our time and selling products on a cost-plus basis. We would just sell products. We thought that wouldn't be any problem because, after all, we were selling our products for maybe a fifth or a sixth or a seventh of the price of any comparable product that the military could buy. But in those days, there were regulations about when you had to supply the government with cost and price data. This was a holdover from robber barons during the Second World War, I think, that gouged the government as well. And so there was this whole set of regulations of how you had to do business with the government. There was an exemption from that regulation, and that exemption was if, I think 40%, I can't remember it anymore, Gene, I'm sure you do, 40% of your revenue of this product line, and it was a standard product line, if 40% was to non-military applications, then you were exempt from that regulation, and you could just sell off a price list, which is the way we sold our products, like all computer companies, rational computer companies do. So that was great, except we got a contract at one point with a very large contract for us at that time. It was a very large contract. It was with a company called Dalmo Victor, and we had happily about 40 or 45% of our business, which was non-military because it was to geological exploration and shipping and a variety of a few things. Now, I mean, our business wasn't that big, so, but we had exemption. And then Dalmo Victor came along, and we got this great big contract, and then we had this catch-22, which was that now our mix of products, because we got the contract, was so big that we now no longer qualified for the exemption. And they said, well, give us cost and price data, and I said no. And they said, you have to, and I said, no, we don't do business like that. And a general from Macon, Georgia, called me, and he said, son, you have to give us that data. And I said, no, sir, we don't do business that way. And he said, I don't know what he said then, but eventually the Secretary of the Air Force provided a waiver, and we did not provide cost and price data. We continued to run the business as a commercial computer business, but it was a warning bell, and it became clear that we needed to look for other alternatives of ways to do business in the future.
In one of the idiosyncrasies of this kind of product, there was a good news and bad news kind of story, because the good news of having a mil-spec computer that was just like a commercial computer was that you could buy the commercial computers and develop your software. That was good for the maker of the commercial computer. It almost enabled us to starve to death because no one really needed to buy the mil-spec computers until later. And the good news part of that story, we had lots of orders for ones and two, but it was years, it seemed like, before anyone bought any volume. But the Moore's Law came into effect and really bailed us out, because by the time they did buy in large volumes, it was always the old stuff that had been developed 4 or 5 years earlier. And so the price of the parts and everything had fallen by a factor of 10, and so we could make them much more cheaply. And so that's really what saved us. In the end from that was after almost starving to death in the first few years, that finally when they did buy them in volume, they were quite profitable.
I should say there was another reason that we started looking for something other than a mil-spec computer, and it wasn't only this Air Force general that was the motivator. I also, in my infinite wisdom, had decided, I felt, and I think we all agreed, that we were at about a $6 million run rate in revenues, and I had decided and felt that at $10 million we would saturate the worldwide market for mil-spec computers. The good news is that was another motivation to go off and do something else, and the other good news is that we hadn't nearly saturated the market for mil-spec computers.
We hadn't found Leo, who brought it up.
Why are you not agreeing? Ken, as a takeoff from this, would you explain to the audience interconnect? What it was and what it allowed us to do?
Well, I'm sure most of you are too young to know, but there was a time when all telephones were supplied by AT&T. And there was a decision that came about in, when did it come about?
68.
68.
68.
Carter phone.
68.
Yeah,
Carter phone.
1968, the Carter phone decision, which said that AT&T had to provide access to their phone lines for other people's equipment to be attached to their phone lines. And that was the genesis of what became known as the interconnect industry, and it is what allowed people to innovate and design and to compete with basically a one-horse monopoly in the telephone industry.
Bob, can you describe the Bell interconnect protection card?
Well, you know, the FCC came out with this decision, which of course AT&T didn't like all that much, and so AT&T for a few years they sort of accepted it and grumbled, and then what they discovered, the way to submarine it was to say, look, you can't just let anybody connect anything to the network because it'll bring the whole network down. This is crazy. And so what we need to do is we'll design a device that will attach to every trunk at the customer premise, which will protect the network from whatever people hook up to. It was called the CDH. I forget what that stood for. And this was a black box. And of course, everything was rented in those days. You didn't own your equipment either if you bought it from AT&T. So they rented this. So every outgoing phone line you had to have one of these boxes, which cost whatever they could get the local public utilities to let them charge, but it was typically maybe $25, $30 a month for this box per line, if you were going to attach something other than a AT&T PBX or telephone or whatever. And inside this box were a handful of resistors and capacitors and I don't know what, but they cost maybe $3. So the whole deal was just to try to put a damper on the industry. And so we had to live with that for several years before it disappeared. Finally, AT&T gave up and said, okay, we don't need this anymore.
You don't remember that the first time we did it, to their specification, it didn't work, and we found that their spec was so crazy that we had to put in variable devices in order to get it to work.
I mean, that was one thing we learned about telephony. When we sort of skipped over how we decided to do the PBX, maybe we'll come back to that, but once we decided, well, telephony, I mean, that's pretty simple. I mean, we're computer engineers. I mean, telephony, you know, there's these two wires, and they're called tip and ring, and you got this bell, and, you know, how hard could it be? And it turns out it really wasn't that hard if you knew how to do it, which only the AT&T engineers did because they didn't document any of the things they had done. And not only that, but things varied all over the country and place to place, and we learned that the hard way. But eventually we figured it out.
We're going a little more slowly than we thought we were, so on the CBX design, all I would suggest is there anybody in the audience we should acknowledge as helping out with the CBX design?
Oh, absolutely. Well, the initial team that did the product design was a total of 8 people. And the technical father of the CBX was Jim Casson, who's here tonight. Jim, would you stand up? And the marketing father of the CBX, who did all the marketing, came up with a brilliant marketing strategy, was Dick Moley, who isn't here tonight, but he's the other key. But the engineering team was a total of 8 people, including Jim. There was Ken Levezzo, who's here tonight. There's Dave Ladd, Steve Plant, John Edwards. I think, did I miss anybody?
Dave Ladd?
Yeah, I got Dave. Steve. And then there was one of the others, our telephony guy was a guy named Sam Wood. He was the expert on telephony. And there were a couple of others whose names I've lost over the years, unfortunately. But they were the core. And we developed this product from the time the team got in place, all 8 guys were on board, till the time we shipped the first unit was 15 months, which in those days was pretty good. In these days, things turn around even faster than that, but probably not a product of that magnitude.
There was a company in Italy, Siemens Italy Telecommunications. I don't know if you remember this, but when Bob says it only took 15 months, the head of engineering of Siemens Telecommunications Italy visited, and we told him what we were going to do, and he said it's impossible for another 10 years.
I like to describe the forged drive chimes. When we put the system on our telephone system as a test. It was an alpha test. It wasn't good enough to be called a beta test. And every time it failed, the chimes would ring so that the service people would know to go repair it in order to allow a few of us to talk to our wives and loved ones. And the chimes rang so damn many times that many of us went back to church. Ken, who were the first interconnect distributors, and how did we get them?
You know, the interconnect industry began with basically a bunch of little companies around the country, many of whom had been electrical contractors going into the business of installing telephone systems. Their biggest problem was they had no product to install. They had old stuff that was much of it not made in the United States because there weren't a lot of U.S. manufacturers. There was Western Electric, which they couldn't get. There was GT&E, which they basically couldn't get, and otherwise there was a few companies. And so that's what we used as our first distribution channel, were companies that had been electrical distributors, a company in Houston called Fisk Electric, a company in California called Compath, a company in upper New York State.
UTC.
UTC, exactly, UTC. I think we maybe had one more. Was Denny a distributor?
No, Denny wasn't. I'm convinced it was in Denver, which is hard to believe. It was IBT in Denver, but maybe not.
Probably right. Doesn't matter.
Anyway, they were good guys.
Yeah.
We liked them.
Leo, can I ask a question?
Yes.
What is GPW?
GPW is something dreamed up by a guy named Don.
No, he was GPW.
Yes. Great place to work.
Yeah. Well, why don't you tell us about it?
Well, because my list here, I have L. Walter hasn't had a lot of opportunity to talk, and so I thought I'd let him tell us. Why don't you tell us, Walter?
Okay, I'll
I'll add
tell you
us
again. I don't remember exactly who created it. I'm not gonna step on that landmine. At any rate, I do recall we discussed this question of the type of company we wanted to have, and we decided we wanted to have a company where people enjoyed working. And we wanted to have a profitable company, we wanted to have a company that grew, we wanted to have products that made sense to the marketplace, but we also wanted to make a place that was fun and interesting to work at, which was a little different than many of the companies in the Valley. And so we called it a great place to work, just as a way to keep in our mind what we're trying to accomplish, or GPW, I believe the initials. The idea was to creatively figure out ways to make the work environment interesting and challenging, and where everybody could contribute in whatever way they could. And that was it. But in a way that kept the company, where we didn't spend too much money so that we weren't profitable. We always felt profitability was important as well as growth, but finally an interesting place to work. So that's my recollection.
Great. My idea, the objective was to attract, motivate, and keep, because of the turnover problem, the best and brightest people in the country, which we succeeded in doing, I might add. There are two factors that involve employees. One is maintenance factors. Am I getting a fair pay? Do I have good benefits? Are the physical surroundings befitting, of me and my capability? But the motivational factors are the ones that are key. Is the work challenging? Is the atmosphere conducive to creativity and productivity? Because we had super productivity. And do I have equal opportunity to succeed regardless of my race, my religion, my sex, or my sexual preference? We followed all of those and just got tremendous amounts of resumes of outstanding people, many of whom were in the audience. Unfortunately, many are not. And we published something called 28 Attributes of Success at ROLM. And this is where Donna has the Leoisms. They weren't really Leoisms, but they accused me of it. One of them was focus on substance. It's always more important than form. Simple. Avoid bureaucracy. Keep practices simple, but make sure they're communicated, understood, and effective. Sounds easy. Many companies don't do that. Fix problems as we grow. Don't stop growing to fix problems. Don't cover your ass. Solve the problem. These kinds of things were drilled into people. In fact, we had something called a survival course where every new manager, supervisor, and employee was exposed to this philosophy. And the message was, if you can follow this in your workplace, you'll be successful here. If you can't follow it, leave now, because it's just a matter of time. And it worked very, very well. We had outstanding people. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Walter. Now, the next question on my list is, Ken, when did we go public and how did it go?
I think 1975.
I think 6.
76?
Maybe
What's
it
a
was,
year here and there?
maybe it was 5, yeah.
It's,
Anyway, didn't go anywhere for the year.
it's one of those years, and it was the IPO was not a booming success. I think we went. The initial pricing of the IPO was $7. Is that right? Jack, is that right?
I thought it was 14.
14.
And it stayed 14 for a year. That's how I remember.
Oh yeah, I'm just off by a factor of 2. I was hoping it was 7 because the rest would be better. But anyway, it was 14. It went to 14 1/8, and then proceeded down to around 10. Stayed at 10 for about 2 years, so it wasn't a great successful IPO, but it was a great buy.
I can remember stock analysts used to write up, you'd get write-ups from the analysts, and they'd talk about CBX and telecommunications and just a little aside about saving you from the communist hordes. And so one day I was talking to an analyst, and I said, why don't you ever, I have a problem. I'm general manager of the division, and we never hear anything. You never tell us how great we are. And he said, Leo, let me tell you, if you're a good telecommunications company, the price-to-earnings ratio is 25, 30, 35, 40. If you're a great military computer company, it's 8 or 9. And I said, have you seen our new telephone?
You know, I think that is an interesting perspective. I don't exactly remember, but I would say that our price-earnings ratio at 10 was below 10, or on the order of 10 times earnings. And this was a company that never had grown less than 50% in revenue and earnings every year. So it sort of makes some of the bubble pricing seem quite extraordinary.
So my next question is, why did we build a campus? And I'm going to answer it so we can do it quickly. We were spending a lot of money on a Christmas party every year, or not a Christmas party, on a picnic. And as we got bigger and bigger and bigger, there were more and more people coming to the picnic, and the picnic was getting kind of out of hand. We got into some real problems because there was alcohol served at this picnic. And so somebody said, you know, for the amount of money we spend on a picnic, we could actually carry a loan to build an athletic facility. Why don't we find out from the employees if they'd rather have a picnic or an athletic facility on campus? And so we said, okay, we'll try that. And so we sent out a questionnaire to the employees, and 90% would prefer to have a gym rather than a picnic. And so that's how we got the picnic, or that's how we got the gym, and the. And then why a campus? And the answer is very simple. A campus was befitting for the kind of employee that we had. Right? Right. Okay, we're getting there. Why did IBM invest in us in 1983, Ken?
God knows.
You want to answer
You know,
that?
Intel first, and then.
You know, IBM, after the Justice Department quit suing IBM for antitrust, IBM started looking at other things it could do, and IBM, about a year before they invested in ROLM, they invested in Intel. I don't know if anyone knows that. IBM was a large stockholder of Intel in the early 80s. And then they invested in ROLM. They invested because we went to them and said, you know, what we think is going to happen is there's going to be this merger of voice and data in the world, and we figure we're about as good as anybody there is in voice, and you're about as good as anybody there is in data, and we ought to get together and start trying to do some joint marketing and some joint product developments and try and move this opportunity along. And that's why they invested in the early 80s.
I think we'd like to have some questions, so I'm just going to ask the last question of the founders, and that is, what contributions do you believe ROLM made to Silicon Valley? Bob, how about we start with you?
Well, I think the best thing about what ROLM contributed was the culture that developed at ROLM that we've talked a lot about here tonight, and the culture developed not because the four of us were able to make it happen or create it or define it, but we knew the kind of place that we wanted to work and the kind of people that we wanted to work there, and what we tried to do was enable it and encourage kinds of productivity and creativity things that emerged, and basically get out of the way and try not to screw it up as it developed. And so there was a culture that emerged that was done by the people in this room, a lot of them, and many thousands of others. And it was very unique, we think, and then it diffused throughout the valley. And I think that was, to the extent that has diffused in other companies, and many successful ROLM people started other companies and were key players in have been key players in other companies. And that's really our contribution to the valley, I think.
Walter?
Yeah, I agree with Bob. Yeah, I completely agree with Bob, and the only thing I would add is I think we built on some of the examples that we had seen before, particularly from Hewlett-Packard, and just did we just enhanced what they had done, and I think successfully did a little better.
Okay. Ken?
Yeah, I think that's the most important contribution we made.
How about you, Gene? Same?
Yeah, I think people's being here who would testify to that too.
I just want to recall the best telephone conversation I ever had was with Ken Oshman. He said, "You got the option." Questions? Shall we have some questions? There's a question way in the back. Of course, it would be. No, my microphone's coming, so you don't have to hurt yourself. He's as far away as anybody can possibly be. Isn't that amazing? Or would you identify yourself and then ask the question, and we'll turn off your microphone if we don't like it.
Can you hear me here? Yeah, my name's Mark, and I had a question about that number one student back grading the papers. Is that because the answers were right, or because you're using his paper to grade the rest?
I didn't hear what he said. What did he say?
He asked why I used Bob's paper to grade the others by, I think. It was faster. It was faster to find a working example than to solve the problem myself, given how fast I was at solving problems.
I guess the answer is if they weren't right, he didn't know it.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry.
I'm Karen Tucker. Can you tell me something about the famous ROLM bus trips?
Did you hear?
No, I didn't hear the question.
Did you hear?
Maybe Jack Melchior could help us out.
What was the question?
Bus trips.
Some bus trip?
The bus. What bus?
these famous Rome bus trips weren't so famous. Norma Melker might talk to you about them.
Hey, now, Audrey Hogan told me I should ask you about the bus trip, so,
Oh, these probably the board.
yeah.
The ROLM bus, not a bus trip. The ROLM bus, not a bus trip.
She meant the wrong bus.
Let me.
Got a Rome link.
Everybody's right. Rome bus was much more important than the Rome bus trip. But since you mentioned her name, I hope some of you got to see Les Hogan, who was here this evening. Les it wasn't in shape to stay on, but you know, Les was on our board from the early days, and of course Les was one of the pioneers of the semiconductor industry, having been essentially the first guy that started Motorola Semiconductor, and then moving here to run Fairchild Semiconductor, and he was a great contributor and a member of our board. And what Audrey was talking about is that we used to, whenever we would go somewhere with our board of directors, we would normally hire a bus, and we'd get on the bus, and I don't think it bears repeating what happened on those buses.
Yeah, my name is Russ McHugh, and I'm not a ROLM alumni, and so I missed, how did you get from mil-spec computers to phone switches?
Did you hear it?
Should I answer?
Sure.
Anyone else want to answer? You know, what happened was, I mean, we literally thought, and all of us thought, that we had saturated the market, or were about to saturate the market for mil-spec computers, and we needed a second product line. And so we began an intense sort of study group, figuring out what it meant to do a strategy, figuring out how you could figure out and plan and all this. And so we were doing all this formal good stuff, and at the same time, it wasn't producing much. And a friend of mine, a guy named Tom Fatjo in Houston, called me and he said, "Ken, there's this company in Dallas you have to come see. They need some money, and I don't know whether to invest or not. And anyway, it's probably something you ought to go do." And so I don't know if do you go with me, Bob? Bob and I went to Dallas, and we visited a company that was making a computer-controlled PBX sort of monstrosity. And it actually came to market eventually.
I think they sold
they
a couple
folded.
of them. It was a very highly specialized thing, very expensive.
Yeah.
But he used a data general computer, an off-the-shelf data general computer, just plugged into it with a bunch of other stuff. But,
Right. And so, and just serendipitously, we had hired Dennis Pabujian, who was running operations and had come out of the interconnect industry, and Tony Carollo, who was our chief financial officer, both of whom had come out of the interconnect industry at a company called Arcata, and they said, "Don't do this." And it took us a while, but we eventually convinced ourselves there was a business and that we could make a contribution and we could build a quite innovative product. And we expected to be able to grow to be about a $30 million company.
Now, it's interesting that I was made general manager of mil-spec computers because they figured it was safe. It's only going to go to 10 million, so how can he screw it up? And I think I got it up to about 20, but Dennis Pabujian got it up over 100 million, so good for Dennis. Any other questions? There's the question always in the back. Would the microphone please go to that person holding
she has
both
a
hands
microphone
up?
and a question.
She's holding two hands up. You only can have one question.
Listening to your story, it occurs to me, as Dr. Melkor might agree, is that you weren't that fungible. You didn't actually decide
Hand him the microphone. He's sitting right here. Right here. See the man with...
Yeah, make Jack answer.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I didn't really. Ken said I funded them, but when they came back with the plan that finally made sense, they told me that they would rather I join them on an equal basis rather than as a venture capitalist. And I put in the $15,000. So that's the reason I did it. They were cheap.
My theory is you hire the best and brightest people in the Bay Area, and you challenge them and you let them go crazy, and you have a culture that allows them to really go home go home and once a month look in the mirror and say, "Rome was so lucky to have me." Not every night, because that's a malcontent. Once in 6 months, because that person is just not doing enough to really get by. But it is the employees. And it's the employees and how you treat them. Right? Or do you have other ideas?
I think luck helps.
Oh, luck.
I think luck is good.
Was certainly true in my case.
Luck is another way of saying what was going on in the whole environment at the time. I mean, it was luck that someone invented a transistor and someone figured out how to make these integrated circuits, and we happened to come along at a time in our life where that was going on, and so there were certainly that combination of what was happening in this environment, what was happening. I remember talking in our very first time, like, why are we doing it here? Why don't we go someplace we'd rather live than here? I liked to ski at the time. And we pretty quickly came to the conclusion that really, because of what was happening in this environment, this was the only place that you could do what we were trying to do at that time, too. So that was an important factor.
Probably could have done it at Route 128 in Boston, but you'd freeze to death. I mean, that was another place where this kind of stuff was
There were
going
two
on.
universities. I mean, when we went to graduate school, you either went to Stanford or MIT. There was no place else of that caliber. Those were the choices that we faced for training, too.
I'd throw out one other thing. I mean, there is a common thread here. We all went to Rice University as undergraduates. And it's an excellent school for engineers, but one of the characteristics was you worked your butt off. I mean, it was really hard, and you learned to focus, to work hard, to, manage your time if you wanted to have any social life or whatever. And doing a startup company, man, that was just like being back at Rice. It was pretty easy.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Yes, okay, where?
Thank you so much. I'm a ROLM alumni and enjoying this evening very much. And I like what's happened in the past and the reconciliation. And please tell us what each and every one of you are doing now and what's next.
Oh, what are we doing now and what's next? And so why don't we start with Ken, because I think he's the only one working.
He's the only one doing anything.
I am probably the only one. I am the only one working. Although,
That's what I said.
although that's not to say everybody on this platform doesn't work real hard. I'm the only one being underpaid. And I am CEO of a company called ROLM Corporation, and have been for the last 14 or 15 years. We make a networking technology to allow everyday devices, things like lights and pumps and valves and electricity meters, to talk to each other and to the internet to provide some sort of function which will reduce costs, improve safety, save energy, do whatever. A control system to run this auditorium or so on. That's what I'm doing. I've been doing that for quite a while. It's an enormous opportunity. We have a great culture. We have a great set of employees at Echelon. It would be another Rome as soon as we can get it to grow 50% a year and do 20%, and do 20% pre-tax, and we'll get there.
Okay, Bob is teaching, right?
Beg pardon?
You're teaching, are you not?
And I have done a little teaching, but I'm not currently teaching.
Oh.
I'm basically retired, involved with some nonprofits, also on the consulting professor at Stanford, and I get involved in the engineering school with some of the graduate students and some of the research, and I taught for a few years, and so I do things that I'm interested in, that are fun, but enjoy as well.
Walter?
Okay, I am involved in mostly nonprofit things. I'm on the board of the Hoover Institution. I'm involved with Junior Achievement. I'm on the international board of Junior Achievement, and have been trying to help the Russians understand capitalism. I studied Russian and been to Russia a number of times, and we've graduated almost 2 million kids from our program in Russia. So other than that, I'm not doing anything.
Okay. Gene?
And I'm retired. I have 4 grandchildren under 5 years of age, and that's probably the biggest interest in my life right now is my family.
I've been retired for 22 years, living in Hawaii in the lap of luxury with the greatest weather in the world, thanks to these gentlemen and you. And I've had a wonderful time. I've been married 52 years. My wife. And in addition to grandchildren, I have 2 great-grandchildren. Any other questions?
Yes.
Any other questions? Because
Yes.
if not, oh yes, sir.
Yes. Yes, just a second.
Oh, she said she was first.
Yeah,
Who knows?
I think that you halfway answered my questions. We all know that the HP way connotes community involvement. Is there a ROLM way that also involves the community?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, ROLM way, I think everybody said that since we borrowed a lot from HP because their way was, we thought, a good way, and it just didn't go far enough. We just took it a little step farther, we think, and there was absolutely a ROLM way, and I think somebody here mentioned that it has been diffused throughout the Bay Area. There is actually a management company in the Bay Area whose name is Great Place to Work Incorporated. I found them on the internet. I contacted them and said, would they be interested in some history of what happened at ROLM, and they said no. That gentleman had a question?
With the different hardware platforms, my name's Jim Rankin, by the way. I'm an alumni, and I'm still working on the product today. So,
oh wow!
With the 7000s that you had and the 8000s, that's obviously was all ROLM. And then when IBM came in, the way I understood it was they gave us $100 million for research and development. I thought when they first bought into us, maybe in '83. But the 9751 then came about, right, with the 9004 and the 9005. Was that all ROLM there, or was that IBM? And then was there another product after that never hit the market when Siemens came in and purchased it, and then came out with their 9006 ICOMs?
All of the CBX product line was developed by ROLM even after IBM got involved. No, IBM didn't give us a lot of money for additional development. When they acquired us, I mean, we were fairly autonomous and just kept doing what we were doing, and began to try to integrate our products better with IBM. IBM then in 88 through 90 basically sold the company then to Siemens, who is a telecommunications company that makes the same kind of products. And so at that point, they began merging the product lines, and all of the future developments then after Siemens got involved were sort of melded with the Siemens product development. And so all of the 7, 8,000, 9,000 series CBXs were all developed by ROLM.
I think John wants to say a couple of words.
Well, one thing that certainly is clear to me that the ROLM Corporation, the leadership team is just spectacular. Thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful evening. You all deserve it. You all deserve it. It's a great team.
Very well.